Did you know that Crash Test Dummies cost over $1 million each? There seem to be only 2 companies that produce them, and they only make around 300 of them a year. Most of the dummy is handmade by people. I guess it's probably not worth automating too much of the process since it's quite a low volume production, and that would allow a faster development cycle too. The dummies are generally designed not to break these days, so they're built much tougher than humans but packed with sensors to measure pressure, torque, acceleration and so on. I really like to do some more dangerous stuff in my YouTube channel, but I don't want to get demonetized, so I'm going to build a crash test dummy to do the things for me. I'm going to use multiple materials, wood, steel, 3D printing, pretty much everything. I'm going to put some sensing in so that we don't actually need to smash it up, but I'm going to have some breakaway sections because I think that's going to be better on video if we can see what would actually happen to a human. We're going to start with some CNC parts out of plywood, and essentially what we're going to do here is make a box which is going to end up being the pelvis. That's got a hole through the middle where the spine goes. So we've got some fairly basic parts to cut out here, just using a 6mm down cutter, a couple of pieces with nice curves on them, which are going to basically make up what would be the human pelvis bone. That whole box is fixed together with glue and lots of screws, so it should be pretty tough. I don't think it's going to take too much impact, but I guess we'll see how it goes, and that's the fun of the game. So just finish that box off, screwing all the sides together, and we should have something which hopefully resembles, well, a Crash Test Dummies pelvis. The spine is going to be made of steel. I got some 25 by 25mm box and some 25 by 50mm box. So this is going to have strain gauges attached, so we need to drill some holes out there to allow the bolts to go through. I'm going to weld all of that together, so we're making 2 of those pieces of box into a nice T-piece to hold the strain gauges on either side, and we're going to weld that onto the spine in a kind of another T-shape. But before we see how that fits together, it's time for a quick ad from the video's sponsor, which is War Thunder. War Thunder's a free-to-play military action game available on multiple platforms including PC, PlayStation, Xbox and Mac. War Thunder has advanced graphics and the game features are formed within the laws of physics, including the clouds, water, wind and dirt, which behave just like they would in the real world. The game includes well-known military vehicles and also prototype vehicles from the last 100 years. That includes ground force, naval and aviation from multiple nations. Players can take control of multiple types of vehicles in a single game session, like flying a helicopter up above the clouds while also piloting a ship. Each item in the game can be improved by unlocking extra devices like armour or special equipment, as well as improving a vehicle's crew. The player can also customise things like the skins of a vehicle, the camouflage decals and other decorative elements. And you can play War Thunder over the entire globe from Africa to Alaska. The maps are super realistic, including the location's atmosphere, effects and sounds. There's always something new in War Thunder, so if you've played it before then it's worth checking back to see the new features. Download War Thunder for free from the link in the video's description. All new players and those who haven't entered War Thunder for 6 months or more will receive 100,000 Silver Lions, a week of renting legendary German ground vehicles, 3 premium vehicles as a gift forever, XP boosters, a week of premium account access and other bonuses. Click the link in the description now to get all of this. The season of German gifts will come to an end soon. Right, let's assemble the first bits of this dummy. So those 2 pieces push together to make the spine, which is the metal part, and the pelvis, which is that wooden box. Now this spine goes all the way through and it pops out the bottom. It's a pretty tight push fit at the moment, but I'll probably put a clamp around the base to hold it and make sure it doesn't slip out once the crash test dummy gets up to some crashes. The T-piece that I made here is to hold 2 strain gauges, and that's where the ribs are going to be attached. I've got 2 strain gauges which are rated at 100 kilograms, and this is the sort of thing you'd have in a pair of scales for weighing things. So we've plugged those into a board later and we'll be able to get the data out. There's one of those on each side, and those are just bolted through the T-piece there, through the box section with some 6mm bolts. I need to make some ribs to go on each side. I made this metal bender ages ago as a metalworking project when I first got my welder. The rollers are a bit far apart. It's also been sat in my shed for multiple years, which is why it's all rusty. But basically there's a bottle jack on the other side there, so I can pump it up and then we can roll metal through it to curve it. Obviously it doesn't quite reach to the end, so there's a bit of a fold, but the main part that it makes is nicely curved. I need to make 2 L-shaped brackets which fit onto either side of the rib cage and then go onto the other end of those strain gauges that we've already fitted to the central spine. So I'm just cutting up a piece of box here, and I'll cut the other diagonal corner as well, and that'll make me 2 L shapes. So I'll just clean up the end here, and that'll be perfectly good to weld onto my rib cage. So we're just going to weld that onto each of those curved sections, and that gets us everything in the right orientation to attach to the strain gauge. So I decided, because my bender won't go all the way to the end, I'm just going to basically roll round one really long piece of steel and then cut the individual ribs out of that so they all have the same radius. So I'm just going to roll that tighter and tighter and tighter, jacking it up as we go, and making sure that we don't roll the metal through the rollers more than once. And then we can just cut that up with an angle grinder, and that will give us lots of short sections that all have the same bend in them. And that will give us multiple ribs with multiple lengths to fit on the rib cage, after a bit of adjusting, of course. So we're just going to weld those ribs on to the first piece of rib we made, which has that L-shaped bracket on. Now my welding's not quite as good as it was last summer because I haven't done any welding for nearly a year because the weather's been bad and I haven't made any funny bikes. But that gives us two rib cages which fit onto the strain gauge, one for the left and one for the right. And those just bolt on to the tapped holes which are in the strain gauges already. So there's the assembly so far. Obviously we've only got one strain gauge for each side of the rib cage. We could have one on each rib, but I don't think that data is actually going to be that useful to us for our purposes. So for now we're going to leave it at that. So that's feeling pretty substantial with all that steel in it. We'll come back to wiring those strain gauges in when we do the electronics in a bit, but for now we're going to do some 3D printing. This is part of the spine, so we're going to have multiple spine sections on the neck so that the neck can bend around. These yellow sections are part of the head because that's the closest to Crash Test Dummy colour that I've got. And this is another piece of that spine segment. And another piece of the head. Just a quick thanks to my 3D printing sponsor. Thanks to Lolsbot for supporting my channel with 3D printers. I'm using the HS 1.2mm nozzle here, so we've got some really fat extrusions to make some really tough parts. And all of these parts are printed in Pro PLA Plus from 3D Fuel, so check out 3dfuel.com. This is a gooseneck mic stand, which is the sort of thing you'd have on a DJ console or a tour bus with a microphone on the other end. I've put a bit of sleeving around one end to make that a uniform diameter, and that's going to fit into a 3D printed clamp that fits on my spine. So basically this is going to poke out of the top of the body and form part of the neck. So that can bend in all directions and it'll stay put wherever I put it. Now it's time for those spine sections. I've cut out some foam discs which fit in between those, and those are all going to get stacked together and put onto that gooseneck mic stand. So I'm going to glue the foam onto each one. I've got super glue with activator, and then basically we can simply stack them on top of the base section which fits onto that spine with a square hole. So the rest of those just stack on top. I've got about 10 of those all together, so we make up that whole spine segment. There's a special one at the top, and on top of that goes the top of the head. And the top of the head is screwed to the head surround, which goes around to the back of the head, and that makes up the majority of our head, apart from the face, which we're going to come on to later. So there's the whole head and the spine assembly. I've got bungee cord threaded through there, which basically helps stop those twisting. So now that neck is flexible and I can put it wherever I want to, and because of that gooseneck mic stand in there, basically that holds its position. That bungee cord isn't that tight, so that's pretty good. We should be able to see that kind of classic look in a camera of whiplash or whatever happens to it. And I think that's quite a lot like a human spine. I was going to build the whole spine like this, and now I wish I had, but maybe we'll come back and do a version 2 sometime. If you ever watched Mythbusters with Adam Savage and co, you'll remember that they frequently used a crash test dummy called Dexter. Dexter was originally a real crash test dummy, but it got rebuilt and modified over the series. In one episode they specifically replaced the legs with wood that would break with about the same force as a human bone. I want to do it that way, but also I think we need some flesh and muscle to cover the bones. I was considering using silicone rubber cast in 3D printed negative moulds, just like the way I made Open Dog's feet. But that's going to get expensive, so instead I found a hot melt rubber called Vinamold, which you can melt down and reuse multiple times. Now the problem is that this doesn't melt until it gets to 160 degrees centigrade and water boils at 100, so we can't use 3D printed plastic moulds, we'll have to make them from something else. This kind of reminds me of something.
But only the fool would say, yeah, I'll enter the nightmare of cake.
It stimulates the part of the brain called Shatner's bassoon.
One girl threw up her own pelvis bone.
I'm 3D printing the positive parts that I eventually want to cast in, not cake, in Vinamold, and then basically we're going to make moulds off them. So I'm using some release wax, which I'm going to spread all over. There are some build lines which I've tried to sand out, but essentially we don't want that to get stuck in the mould that we're going to make from the positive part. I then set about making the negative mould from the positive prints that I've got. So I'm using Modrock plaster of Paris bandages, which is what your leg or arm or whatever gets set in if you break a bone and you go to hospital and you have a plaster cast. So this is basically bandages impregnated with plaster. You soak them in water and wring them out as much as you can, and then spread it all over the thing, and it sets hard and makes a shell. So after quite a bit of build up there, making sure the edges are especially strong so they don't break when I try and pull the print out, we've got various moulds here for the parts. So these are basically going to be the calves and the upper arms. Now I'm going to try and separate the mould out of there, which actually wasn't too difficult, using some kitchen knives and other implements there to try and get the 3D print out. And eventually, after a bit of wrangling, I managed to get it out. And that seems to have made quite a good mould actually, which hasn't got a bad surface finish. And that will withstand the heat so that we can pour in the Vinamold once we've heated it up, and it won't melt the plastic mould that we now put to one side. So I'm putting the wood in there, which is going to simulate the bone. This is the calf, so there's 2 bones. And now I'm just basically going to block up the end with a temporary piece that will break out, so we can actually cast the rubber all around the wooden bones on the inside of our limbs. So we've got 4 moulds altogether, 2 upper arms and 2 shins or calves, whichever way you look at it. It's time to cut up some Vinamold, which is a bit like cutting a rubbery cheese. So I'm just cutting that up into small sections so we've got lots of surface area and it'll be easier to melt. And then I'm popping that into an old pan and I'm just heating it on my kitchen hob. I put it on quite a low heat and it took quite a while to melt, but I didn't want to boil it and get loads of air in it because that'll be really hard to get out. So it looks a bit like butternut squash soup or something, or a lot of cheese melted in a pan. Eventually it did melt almost to liquid. There's still a few lumps in it, but I think it's ready to pour. So there are lumps which will just go into the bottom hopefully, and that'll be fine, but it pours quite easily and I've got more than enough there to fill up the mould. Despite my best efforts, there is quite a lot of air in it, which has risen, and then the top has cooled, so it's kind of solidified into a bubbly skin, a bit like a cake that's gone wrong. So I decided to take a hot air gun to it and try and remelt the top, but you can see a huge bubble there with holes underneath it. Eventually I managed to remelt it and get rid of most of the bubbles, but it's not a great finish on top really. So there's the last pour into the last lower leg. Quite a lot of lumps there, but they all settle to the bottom anyway, so we'll see what happens once it's cooled down. So hopefully reasonably okay. The last one needs a bit more work with the hot air gun. It's turned into a bit of a mash, but yeah. So that shrunk back quite a bit in the mould, so I'm not totally sold on the results here. I think probably with hindsight I'd probably be better off 3D printing negative moulds and using some cheap tin cure silicone, but I wanted to try this stuff out, so here we are. I'm not really sure how you degas it. I think for silicone you normally put it in a vacuum chamber and suck all the air out, but in this case we'd still get all the bubbles rising to the top and the top solidifying in a kind of skin, and having all those bubbles sort of in the top there as it's cooling. So you probably need a heated vacuum chamber to keep it hot while you degas it. I don't really know how it's supposed to work. But anyway, we're going to break the ends off now and try and get the rubber out with the sticks attached. So those pieces came out easily enough. I just sort of tacked them in really, rather than attaching them to everything. So I'm going to score around the outside of this and try and separate it around the top where it's overflowed slightly, and then try and get it out. And I hoped that I could just push it out. Apparently Vinamold has a built-in mould release. It's actually slightly waxy to the touch, but no such luck. So yeah, ended up with a screwdriver trying to pry it out of the mould, and most of the moulds actually got broken. So eventually we did get it out. There's a few screwdriver marks. It's not a great cast in all fairness, and the other parts were really hard to get out, and I basically had to tear the moulds apart, and the Modrock's actually stuck to it for some reason. I guess my mould had some texture to it, so that's not great. Anyway, what we've actually got are the 4 pieces. They're fairly messy though, and not that great looking, and the larger ones have chunks missing and some plaster embedded in them. I decided I should cover those up with something, so I've got some of this non-slip stuff for putting under rugs that you can get from IKEA, which is basically a plastic mesh. So now it looks like cheese inside cheesecloths, but it's a bit more presentable and has a nicer finish. There's actually quite a lot of mass to these, which is another thing that we want for the dummy. So I've attached the ends, which are 3D printed, which are basically the joints of the dummy, and these have bolts through which actually clamp that plastic down on the wood on each end. We need some joints for the arms and legs, so I found these wooden balls on Amazon, and I'm drilling a big 20mm hole in there with a flat drill bit, and then I'm going to stick some steel in. So I've got some 20mm steel, which I've cut up, and basically finished that off, and then we're going to glue that in with some glue. I'm using Gorilla Glue, which is that foaming type of glue, so we can put that all inside, stick the stuff in, and basically turn the thread there so the glue goes up and down the thread and fills all the holes. Then quite a bit of time later, once the glue's gone off, you can see it's foamed out on those ones, and the other ones on the left there I've trimmed back so that we can get rid of all the mess, but those are stuck on really well. And that 20mm studding is going to bolt through the hole I left in the piece at the top of the arm, and also the same for the thighs. I've made some shallow ball joints for the arm, and we're basically going to bungee those in so that they're stuck in, but they can also dislocate. So after quite a bit of wrangling, tensioning this up, we've got this bungeed on now, and the bungee runs through 2 screws and allows those arms to sort of sit there. They kind of float, it's not too bad, and we can pose them all around, which is quite good. And on the back here, we've got some shoulder blades, which are just glued onto a block of foam at the moment. With hindsight, I probably should have used more of these gooseneck mic stands so that we could put those in the joints, and then I could actually pose this, and it wasn't all floppy, and then we could actually pose it like an action figure, which is a bit more like the original Crash Test Dummies. Here are the thighs, which are using those HS 1.2mm nozzle prints and some more plywood. There's quite a bit of mass to them because they've got that studding bolted through and this fairly thick wood and plastic making them up. Those are bungeed onto some sockets in the hips, exactly the same as the arms with thicker bungees. They're kind of just lashed on however I thought at the moment, but basically we can repose them if we need a standing pose or whatever. And that gives us quite a wide range of motion there, so we can move the legs all around just like a human. I've designed the knee like an open socket, so that fits around a piece which is bolted through the knee at the top there, and basically I'm going to bungee that on again. There is an end stop, but it can pass that if you actually want to break the knee backwards. So I've done that on both knees. We've got quite a lot of flexibility, but we can drive it all the way if there's a terrible accident. So those are my legs all assembled. I've put feet on, which are basically a ball joint, and we've got quite little feet, and that means I can put the feet into any human shoe or boot that I want to without too much effort. I found these artist's hands, which you can pose, and then presumably that's for doing life drawing or something. I got left and right pairs, and I'm going to shove those into a TPU print because they've got a taper on, so that fits into there. And then I've again got 2 bones in the arm, although they're not very long, and we've got a hinge with a TPU washer, so that we can basically put all that together, and then we can bolt that down and pose the arm. So that's just got a single bolt that runs all the way through, does up tight, and now the arms will stay put wherever I put them. So yeah, it seems to be about the right proportions. I've made it to be roughly the same size as I am, so its legs are the right length, and you know, the forearm is the same length as mine and so on, and the top of the head should come to the top of where my head is. So we need to put the electronics in, but first of all, I think it's going to need a face. Here it is. Well, I did the best I could with the bricks I had. Yes, it's Lego. So obviously if the Lego breaks, you know your face would have broken, and that's the whole point in a crash test dummy. But before we fix that on, we've got to put some electronics inside the head. So we're going to put 2 accelerometers in it. So I'm using the MPU 6050, one of these cheap GY521 boards. That's partnered with a Teensy, and I've got the IMU in its flat orientation there. So I put some calibration offsets into my code which divide down the raw data you get to give me 1G of gravity. So now as I move the IMU so each axis is pointing upwards, we should see 1G of gravity, which is the normal gravitational pull, on our data. And if I bash each one around, then we get much higher numbers. So basically 4 to 5G is what you might experience on a roller coaster, and 9G is what a fighter pilot might experience. And this one will measure up to 16G, which should be enough for our purposes. The second IMU is another MPU 6050, and that is attached to a Teensy 4.1, and that Teensy is going to record all of the data for all of our sensors. So we've got some switches wide in there. We've got 2 buttons. One starts recording and the other one stops recording, and then the data is written to an SD card. So what I've got here for now is a 3-axis G-force recorder. We can get the SD card and then we can have a look at the data. So that produces a CSV file, which is comma separated values. So if I highlight all of that, I can do this in any spreadsheet package. This is just Excel. We can draw a graph of all the data, and then that gives us the results, for now just for our 3 axes. I'm using SparkFun quick scale boards, which are used to measure the load cells, and I've used these in projects before. They produce data much faster than the cheaper boards that generally ship with them off Amazon or whatever. So those are attached to my load cells, and you can see they work just like weighing scales. So as I push those ribs, we should get a value, and then again that's going to be logged onto our data logger. So we've got an inertial measurement unit with the Teensy in the head. That's sending its data down to our Teensy 4.1 over serial. And I've also attached the 2 load cell boards which live in the back. So that all of that data is sent over serial. The Teensy 4.1 has multiple serial ports. So now we can press start, bash it around, and we can log all that data and see what it looks like. So here's one graph which is all of the data, so we can see me smashing the ribs with my hand, then pushing the ribs a bit more slowly, and then we can see me shaking the head around basically to see if we can simulate whiplash. We've then got a second column, and I've just done some maths in Excel, done a little formula to work out the difference between the head and the body IMU in the front-facing axes. So there we can see the actual difference between the head and the body. I thought it needed some guts with some more body mass, so yeah, I'm using stress balls which have like these water balls inside, or I think they're called Orbeez. So I'm wrapping those up in some more of that mesh, and then basically that's all strung inside like a big wobbly belly, and it's zip tied onto the ribs and the spine. There's one piece in the middle which isn't zip tied in, and that can pull out or fall out if it decelerates too fast. I've stuck the face on with double-sided tape, and now it's time for some testing. So it's actually pretty heavy with all of that mass, with all that rubber, wood and steel, and the stress balls of course. Well, it looks like it's still mostly in one piece. So I think his hip's dislocated, but they might have dislocated before I dropped it, and the knees are definitely broken back the wrong way, and the shoulders are dislocated, but its Lego face is still attached. Yep, so looking like it's mostly in one piece actually. Pretty happy now, look. And the shoulders just pop back in. I have actually bent the ribs though, so that's going to make some interesting load cell data to look at. But the face is still in one piece. So here's the wobbly line where I'm trying to shove it off the shed roof. As it falls, you can see the up-facing axes of the accelerometers actually go into zero gravity, so it becomes weightless till it hits the ground. The big spikes are actually the load cells on the ribs, and then after that, one of our IMUs goes negative because it's in the wrong orientation, and the load cell keeps a constant load as it's resting on its ribs. So I'm pretty happy with that for a 2-week project. We can upgrade any of the things because it's quite modular, so we could change the legs or the arms or anything else. I quite like to give it servo-assisted elbows so it can actually drive a car, but that's maybe coming up in the future. And if there's anything else you'd like to see a Crash Test Dummy do, then put that in the comments below. I'm going to publish all the CAD and code as open source as I usually do, so you can use that in your own projects. All of that's on GitHub, and the link's in the description to this video. So if you'd like to support me through Patreon or YouTube channel membership, those links are in the description as well. And patrons and YouTube channel members get access to all the videos up to a week early, and sneak peeks and pictures of what's coming up, so you can be part of that discussion. And Discord benefits. Alright, that's all for now.